If you're going to tell the story of a metal drummer who's losing his hearing, how do you dramatize that and connect the audience with the character's experience? One of the beautiful things about film is that as a medium that combines both sound and picture, it's actually possible to modify the sound the audience is hearing so that it mimics the perspective of someone with hearing loss. For director Darius Marder and supervising sound editor Nicholas Becker, these representations of Ruben's hearing loss were based on extensive research into how hearing loss sounds that started a year before any other crew were brought onto the film. This video is sponsored by NordPass.
Creating the soundscape of deafness is extremely nuanced, but there are a few simple techniques that are used to great effect in the film.
This is Alex Knickerbocker, and chances are you've probably heard his work at some point watching TV or in a theater. I've learned a lot about film sound from his channel, and so I reached out to see if he would help me understand the artistry that went into the Sound of Metal.
The two biggest factors in how we perceive sound are frequency and amplitude.
In moments representing the beginning of Ruben's hearing loss, things don't just sound quieter but are duller and muffled.
As we start losing our hearing, we're not just losing all frequencies at the same rate. It's not like turning a volume knob down. We're actually losing each individual frequency differently.
Most of what Ruben can still hear are lower end frequencies, and so these frequencies are what we get to hear as the audience when we're in his perspective. Some of the work to create this effect can be done in post-production.
You can mimic that simply by recording your voice into a normal microphone and rolling off all the high frequencies until only those lower frequencies are left.
For example, I could use an equalizer on my voice to cut out the high end and make it sound more muffled like you're hearing now. But creating this effect as accurately and richly as possible starts even in how you approach recording the sound.
There's a type of microphone called a contact mic, and it picks up sound not through the air as a normal microphone would, but through vibrations in solid objects. So the microphone needs to be in direct contact with whatever object it's going to record sound through. So what you end up with is a very different perception of sound because you're not hearing it travel through air as normal, it's coming through very condensed solid matter.
For example, in this scene, a contact mic placed directly on the slide would have a very different perception of the sound of Ruben drumming than a typical microphone would. This difference in perception that can be captured with a contact mic was an important piece of illustrating Ruben's experience of hearing loss for the audience. For Nicholas Becker, sometimes even the existing recording equipment wasn't enough. I was able to build a small microphone that you can put in your mouth without it being broken. We were able to really recall all the inner sounds from Riz, racing heartbeats, blood pressure, tendons moves, muscle and bone movements. But creating a compelling sound experience for the audience and telling the film's story wasn't just about being able to create an accurate representation of Ruben's subjective perspective. One of the most important elements is how the film uses the movement between sonic perspectives and the contrast between loud and quiet moments in the film.
This is ridiculous.
One of my favorite sonic choices throughout the entire film is the use of contrast between perspectives, between loud versus quiet, between delicate versus intense. With a film titled The Sound of Metal, you expect that to be abrasive to some degree. You expect it to be really over the top. The opening sequence of the concert is just that. It's extremely aggressive, it's really intense sound. And then the second you get away from that, it cuts to a peaceful morning inside of basically a camper out in the middle of a parking lot. Using that kind of contrast, just in perspective changes, really draws your attention to how loud something is or how aggressive something is, and then gives you a point of reference that's totally separate from what that was just like. So it guides the audience's attention very effectively.
That contrast between the loud concert and the quiet environment the next day makes us more aware of the sound in the camper and Ruben's environment without drawing too much attention to the sound design itself.
You have all of these little subtle details of the birds outside. The atmospheres feel just a little bit more pristine, and even down to the Foley or the production recordings of a blender going in the morning, and all the little details of the Foley as the characters move around the trailer itself. It's all the stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily think of.
Drawing our attention to these sounds is important because it increases our awareness of their absence the next day as Ruben begins to lose his hearing.
The same idea can be applied when you're switching back and forth between perspectives from the, normal perception of the world around you.
It's probably a 2 out of 10 in terms of his hearing. He's having trouble even communicating with me.
Versus what it's like to perceive those same things without being able to hear them. Having that contrast makes the starkness of silence that much more intense and that much more heavy.
The film spends a lot of time inside Ruben's auditory perspective at the beginning, often tying these moments to more subjective shots that place us inside Ruben's perspective visually. But as the story moves along, more time is spent back in the auditory perspective of full hearing, and the film only uses Ruben's auditory perspective for emphasis. But because the film returns mostly to the perspective of full hearing during Ruben's stay at the deaf community, there are lots of scenes with no dialogue or music. And because of that, the sounds from the environment and the movements of the characters take more of a center stage than they would in most films.
The sound team did a really effective job with this film in the quiet and subtle moments because, from a technical perspective, once you start taking away music, you take away a lot of, over-the-top action stuff. Sonically, there's not really a whole lot to hide behind. So you better make sure that your production sound is really clean. You don't have any traffic. You don't have anything that isn't going on in picture to distract. And you have to make sure that all of the background layers of sounds, from the birds outside to maybe the creaking of the old house, to the wind coming through maybe a drafty point, a window. All of those little details need to be exactly right. One of the hardest balances to find in those moments is how loud you play certain Foley movements. Even the smallest, most delicate cloth movements, if you don't hear those to a degree, a film sounds lifeless, and you don't notice it until it's not there. So during these scenes, when you have a whole group of people not talking, they're just signing to each other, the Foley of cloth movement, the Foley of the actual sound of your hands. If you get really close into a microphone, you can hear that. You can hear that there is some movement to it, but obviously if you overplay that, it's going to sound unnatural and draw attention to itself. So that balance that they struck in those scenes had to have been extremely delicate.
Ultimately, the sound design plays a big role in the emotional story arc and Ruben's character arc in the film. The contrast we talked about earlier of the loud, distorted sounds of the metal concert against both the quieter sounds of the next day and Ruben's hearing loss sets up a kind of sonic motif that bookends the story. Spoilers for the end of the movie ahead. Once Ruben gets cochlear implants, the film's interpretation of what this sounds like while less pleasant and musical than the concert music the film opens with, bears some striking resemblance nonetheless. Through distortion and compression, everything sounds overwhelming, metallic, and grating. At both the beginning and the end of the film, there's a shift from a sound of metal to quiet. And it's Ruben's change in how he perceives these two shifts that marks his character's development. The first shift is something lost, and the second, through the acceptance Ruben has learned, is something gained.